If you're Japanese, or if you've ever taken a DNA test that came back with Japanese ancestry, there's a good chance the story you were told about your own bloodline is incomplete. Not wrong exactly, just missing an entire chapter. A chapter that involves an ice age, a vanished land bridge, and a population so small it could fit inside a single stadium. For decades, the accepted explanation for where the Japanese people came from was simple enough to fit on an index card. Two groups met on the islands of Japan thousands of years ago. One group had been there for a very long time, hunting, fishing, and gathering. The other group arrived later, bringing rice farming with them. They mixed, and that mixture became the modern Japanese population. Textbooks taught it. Museums built exhibits around it. Anyone who asked a geneticist about Japanese origins got roughly the same answer. But over the last few years, and especially in the last 12 months, that tidy two-part story has been quietly dismantled by the very tool that once seemed to confirm it: DNA. Not old, degraded fragments either. Full genomes, pulled from skeletons that have been in the ground for thousands of years, sequenced with a level of precision that simply didn't exist a decade ago. And what those genomes are showing is stranger, older, and far more complicated than anyone expected. To understand how big this shift really is, you have to go back to where the story used to start, and then go back much further than that to where it actually starts. The old model was called the dual structure hypothesis. It said that Japan's population came from two ancestral groups. The first were the Jōmon, people, hunter-gatherer fishers who lived across the Japanese archipelago for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, roughly 16,000 years ago until about 3,000 years ago. That's not a typo. 13,000 years of continuous culture, long before farming, long before writing, long before anything we'd recognize as a state or a kingdom. The second group were the Yayoi, migrants who arrived from the Asian mainland around 3,000 years ago and brought wet rice agriculture with them, along with new tools, new social structures, and eventually the technological base for what would become a unified state. According to the dual structure model, modern Japanese people are essentially a blend of these two populations, with the ratio shifting depending on where in Japan your ancestors lived. It was a clean story. It explained real patterns in the data, and for a long time it held up reasonably well against the evidence available. The problem is that the evidence available kept growing, and every time scientists added more ancient genomes to the picture, the two-population model started showing cracks. The first major crack appeared when researchers sequenced a set of ancient Japanese genomes spanning both the pre-farming and post-farming periods, 12 genomes in total, and compared them not just to each other, but to genomes from across the rest of Eurasia. If the dual structure model were the whole story, you'd expect exactly 2 ancestral signals showing up in the data. Instead, they found 3. There was the Jōmon signal, exactly as expected. There was also a Northeast Asian signal associated with the introduction of rice farming, which lines up with the traditional idea of the Yayoi migration. But then there was a third, later pulse of East Asian ancestry that showed up during the Kofun period, the era of Japan's early imperial state formation, roughly from the 3rd to the 7th century. Nobody had been looking for that third signal because nobody thought it needed to be there. The dual structure model had no room for it. But the genomes didn't care what the model predicted. They showed a third wave of migration and mixture, layered on top of the first two. And that third wave left a permanent, measurable mark on the DNA of everyone descended from that population. This became known as the tripartite model, and it wasn't a minor tweak to the old theory. It was a fundamental rewrite of who the ancestors of modern Japan actually were. Once that tripartite model was on the table, researchers wanted to know how deep its roots went and how strongly it actually shaped people alive today, not just the handful of ancient skeletons available for study. So a team of scientists did something that sounds almost absurdly ambitious. They merged a database of over 170,000 living Japanese people with a set of ancient genomes and ran the comparison at biobank scale. That's not a study of a dozen samples anymore. That's a study of a substantial fraction of a national population, cross-referenced against the deep past. And the results confirmed that the tripartite structure isn't just a historical curiosity limited to a handful of archaeological sites. It's baked into the genetic variation of people living across the entire Japanese archipelago today, with an extremely strong statistical correlation between a person's proportion of Jōmon ancestry and broader patterns in their genome. The same study went further and found something nobody expected from an ancestry analysis: a measurable link between the amount of Jōmon ancestry a person carries and their body mass index. In other words, a population that vanished as a distinct, isolated culture around 3,000 years ago is still quietly influencing the metabolism of people alive. Right now, through more than 100 specific genetic variants, researchers were able to identify and validate across multiple independent groups of people. That's not ancient history sitting inert in a textbook. That's ancient history still active in living bodies, today in ways almost nobody was measuring until very recently. But to really understand why this keeps surprising researchers, you need to go back to where the Jōmon lineage itself came from, because that's where the story gets genuinely wild. A study using DNA extracted from 42 ancient Jōmon individuals set out to trace the deep origin of this population, not just its relationship to later farmers, but where its own ancestors came from before they ever set foot in Japan. The answer places the split extraordinarily early. The genetic lineage that would eventually become the Jōmon broke away from the rest of mainland East Eurasian populations somewhere between 27,000 and 19,000 years ago. To put that in context, that's during the Upper Paleolithic, a period when humans across Eurasia were still living as small, mobile groups of hunters, long before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet, long before anything resembling a city, a written language, or a domesticated animal. And this split didn't happen in comfortable conditions. It happened right around the time the planet was sliding into the coldest stretch of the most recent ice age, a period called the last glacial maximum, when global temperatures dropped so far and ice sheets grew so large that huge portions of the northern hemisphere became nearly uninhabitable. Sea levels fell dramatically because so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice. Coastlines that exist today were dry land back then. Landscapes shifted in ways that would be almost unrecognizable if you could see them now. It's into this brutal environment that the ancestors of the Jōmon people found themselves living and eventually surviving in near isolation. As the Ice Age reached its peak and then slowly began to recede, rising sea levels did something that would permanently shape the next 20,000 years of history. They submerged the land bridges that had connected the Japanese archipelago to the Asian mainland. Before that point, movement between the continent and the future islands of Japan would have been possible, difficult, but possible. After the land bridges disappeared underwater, that connection was severed. The people living on what was becoming an island chain were cut off. Not completely, not forever, but enough to lock in a distinct genetic trajectory that continued for thousands of years with minimal outside contact. This is the part of the story that sounds almost like fiction, but is backed by hard genomic evidence. A small population, isolated by rising seas at the tail end of an ice age, developing in genetic seclusion long enough that their DNA became measurably, permanently different from every other population on the Asian mainland. The same research also found something that complicates the isolation story just enough to make it interesting rather than simple. Northern Siberian populations appear to have contributed to the Jōmon gene pool as well, which helps resolve a debate that had been running for years about exactly how East Asia was first peopled after humans spread out of Africa and across the continent. So it wasn't total isolation from the very beginning. There was contact, mixing, movement, and then isolation in that order, which is a much messier and more human story than the clean two-population narrative ever allowed for. What's remarkable is how small this founding population actually was, and how long it stayed small. Genomic analysis estimates that the Jōmon maintained an effective population size of somewhere around 1,000 people, sustained across several millennia. An effective population size isn't quite the same as a literal head count. It's a measure geneticists use to describe the size of an idealized population that would produce the same genetic diversity patterns observed in the real data. But even accounting for that nuance, the number is startlingly small. Think about that for a moment. A group small enough that you could plausibly fit its entire reproductive population inside a modern sports arena, sustaining itself, adapting, surviving, and passing its genetic material down for thousands of years through generation after generation of an ice age world, and eventually becoming the deep ancestral foundation for one of the largest and most genetically well-documented national populations on Earth today. Researchers studying this population didn't just look at where the Jōmon came from and how big their numbers were. They also, looking for signs of natural selection embedded in the DNA itself, using advanced computational tools designed to reconstruct genetic family trees and detect the fingerprints that adaptation leaves behind in a genome over time. What they found were signs of what's been described as an Ice Age survival toolkit, a set of genetic adaptations that likely helped this small, isolated population endure extreme cold, resource scarcity, and the general brutality of life at the edge of the habitable world during one of the harshest climatic periods in recent human history. Now, here's where the story gets even more layered, because the internal structure of the Jōmon population itself turned out to be more complicated than researchers originally assumed. For years, archaeologists and geneticists had noticed a clear pattern. Jōmon skeletons from the eastern part of Japan tend to carry different mitochondrial DNA lineages than Jōmon skeletons from the western part of Japan. The obvious explanation, the one that made intuitive sense, was that two separate founding migrations had occurred, one populating the east and a different one populating the west, each carrying its own distinct genetic lineage into the archipelago. It's a reasonable hypothesis. It's also, according to a study published in early 2026, probably not what happened. A team led by researchers at the University of Tokyo sequenced complete mitochondrial genomes from 13 newly analyzed Jōmon individuals, excavated from 3 separate shell mound sites in Chiba Prefecture, and combined that new data with previously published sequences to build a dataset of 40 complete Jōmon mitogenomes spanning the entire length of the Jōmon period, from its initial phase all the way through to its final phase before the transition to farming. Then, instead of just looking at the pattern and assuming a cause, they ran simulations to actually test whether genetic drift alone, starting from a single founding lineage, could produce the east-west split that shows up in the real data. Genetic drift is essentially random chance acting on a population over time. Small fluctuations in which individuals happen to reproduce and pass on their genes, which can gradually push separated groups toward different genetic profiles, even without any new migration or mixing involved. And the simulations came back with a clear answer. Under the right conditions, drift alone was sufficient to explain the split. You didn't need 2 separate founding migrations to produce 2 genetically distinct regional populations. One founding lineage, given enough time and enough separation, could drift apart on its own. This reframes a huge chunk of Jōmon prehistory. Instead of 2 migration events explaining regional diversity, the emphasis shifts toward environmental and cultural factors, the different pressures and lifestyles that shaped eastern and western Japan differently over thousands of years, as the more likely drivers of the differences we see today. While all of this was reshaping our understanding of the deep past, another entirely separate thread of research was pulling apart the assumption that Jōmon ancestry looks the same everywhere across the archipelago, because it very much does not. A preprint examining genome-wide data from both modern and ancient individuals turned its attention specifically to the Ryuku Islands, the chain that stretches southwest from the main islands of Japan down toward Taiwan, including Okinawa. Researchers sequenced 273 modern genomes alongside 25 ancient genomes, with the ancient samples dating back anywhere from roughly 6,700 to 900 years before present. What they found was a deep genetic split between the Ryukyu Jōmon population and the mainland Jōmon population, along with demographic patterns, population bottlenecks, and admixture events that unfolded differently in the islands than they did on the main archipelago. This matters for a very concrete reason. It means Japan's genetic landscape isn't uniform, and it never really was. Depending on whether your family's roots trace back to the Ryukyu Islands or to the mainland, whether that's Honshu, Shikoku, or Kyushu, you could carry meaningfully different ancestral signatures, shaped by entirely separate historical trajectories of isolation, population crashes, and later mixing. This is part of why modern DNA ancestry tests sometimes report regional results that don't line up neatly with a single, simple narrative of Japanese origin. It's not an error in the test. It's the genome accurately reflecting a genuinely more complicated history than the simplified version most people grew up hearing. Large-scale studies looking at Jōmon ancestry across the modern population have found this regional variation directly. Jōmon-related ancestry shows up far more strongly among people from Okinawa, at levels reported around 28.5% in some sampled groups, compared to noticeably lower levels in Western Japan, closer to 13% in the same kind of analysis, where genetic ties to Han Chinese populations on the mainland run comparatively stronger. That's not a small difference. That's nearly double the proportion of deep hunter-gatherer ancestry showing up in one region of the country compared to another, all within the same nation, the same modern population, the same general story we used to tell as if it applied uniformly to everyone. And just when the tripartite model of Jōmon, Yayoi, and Kofun ancestry seemed to be settling into place as the new consensus, a further wrinkle appeared. Researchers analyzing the genomes of thousands of people from across Japan uncovered evidence for what looks like a previously overlooked fourth ancestral group, one that challenges even the recently updated 3-part origin story. This newly identified ancestral signal appears to be connected to the ancient Emishi people, a population historically associated with northeastern Japan, a region with its own distinct cultural and political history that stood somewhat apart from the centralizing imperial court further south and west for a long stretch of early Japanese history. If this fourth signal holds up under further scrutiny, and more research will be needed to confirm exactly how it fits into the broader picture, it suggests that even the tripartite model, revolutionary as it was when it replaced the whole dual structure hypothesis, may itself be an incomplete sketch of a genuinely more complex reality. Each time researchers add more ancient genomes and cross-reference them against larger modern datasets, the picture doesn't simplify. It gets richer, more regionally textured, and more resistant to being summarized in a single clean sentence. There's also a thread running through all of this research that has nothing to do with Japan specifically, but connects Japanese ancestry to a much older and much broader story about the entire human species. Buried within these Japanese genomes, alongside the Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun signals, researchers have also identified inherited genetic material from Neanderthals and from Denisovans, two archaic human relatives that interbred with the ancestors of modern humans tens of thousands of years ago, long before any of the population movements we've been discussing took place. This isn't unique to Japan. Populations across Europe and Asia carry Neanderthal and Denisovan. DNA is a legacy of ancient interbreeding that happened as modern humans expanded out of Africa and encountered these other human lineages already living across Eurasia. But within Japanese genomes specifically, researchers have connected certain inherited archaic variants to modern health outcomes, including associations with conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. It's a striking reminder that the DNA sitting in a modern person's cells isn't a single uniform inheritance from one clean lineage. It's a layered composite built up over tens of thousands of years from archaic human relatives, from Ice Age hunter-gatherers who survived conditions almost impossible to imagine today, from farming migrants who arrived with rice cultivation and new technology, and from later population movements tied to the formation of an imperial state. Every one of those layers left a mark, and modern researchers, using tools that didn't exist even 15 years ago, are now able to read those marks with a level of precision that's completely rewriting textbook explanations that had stood largely unchallenged for decades. So what does all of this actually mean, beyond being a fascinating scientific story? For one thing, it means the framework most people have in their heads about Japanese origins, hunter-gatherers plus rice farmers equals modern population, is outdated. It's not wrong in the sense of being fabricated. It captured something real about two of the major ancestral contributions, but it's incomplete in a way that matters. There was a third wave during the Kofun period that textbooks rarely mention. There's a possible fourth ancestral signal tied to the Imishi that researchers are still working to fully characterize. There's a deep isolation event tens of thousands of years before any of that, when the ancestors of the Jōmon split off from the rest of East Eurasia during one of the coldest, harshest stretches of the last ice age, and then found themselves cut off entirely once rising seas swallowed the land bridges connecting the archipelago to the continent. There's evidence that this isolated population wasn't purely isolated the whole time, with contributions from northern Siberian groups complicating the picture in a way that resolves old debates while opening new questions. There's a regional east-west genetic divide within the Jōmon population that turns out to be better explained by drift and environment than by separate founding migrations. And there's a clear, striking divide between Ryuku and mainland ancestry that means two people, both accurately described as Japanese, both with deep roots in the archipelago, can carry meaningfully different genetic histories depending on exactly where their ancestors lived. It's worth pausing on just how recent most of this material actually is, because that timeline says something important about where this field is headed next. The tripartite model didn't exist as a formal evidence-backed framework until fairly recently, and the biobank scale confirmation linking it to more than 170,000 living people came only a few years after that. The whole metagenome study revisiting the East-West Jōmon split was published in early 2026. The research proposing a possible fourth ancestral component tied to the Emishu surfaced only months before that. The deep dive into Ryukyu-specific ancestry, built from hundreds of modern genomes and dozens of ancient ones, is still circulating as a preprint, meaning it hasn't even finished the formal peer review process yet. And the study tracing the Jōmon lineage all the way back to its split from mainland East Eurasians during the depths of the last ice age was published within the last few weeks. Stack all of that together and you get a picture of a field that isn't slowing down or converging on a final answer. It's accelerating. Nearly everything discussed here has been published within roughly the last 2 years, and a meaningful chunk of it within the last few months alone. That pace is unusual even by the standards of modern genomics, and it reflects just how much cheaper and more accessible high-resolution ancient DNA sequencing has become. Samples that would have been too degraded or too limited in quantity to analyze reliably a decade ago are now yielding full genomes, complete mitochondrial sequences, and detailed population-level statistics. Which means the version of this story available today is very likely not the final version. Given the rate at which new ancient genomes are being sequenced and new modern data sets are being cross-referenced against them, it's entirely plausible that within another year or two, researchers will identify further ancestral components, refine the timing of the Kofun-era migration wave, or narrow down exactly how the proposed Emishi-linked ancestry fits into the broader tripartite framework. Anyone revisiting this topic even a year from now should expect the details to have moved again. For anyone who has taken a consumer DNA test and seen a breakdown of Japanese ancestry, or Jomon ancestry, or regional East Asian components, this research is the reason those percentages exist in the first place. And it's also the reason those percentages keep getting revised as reference databases improve. The regional variation isn't a glitch. Well, it's an accurate reflection of genuinely different population histories playing out across different parts of the same modern nation. Someone with strong genetic ties to Okinawa is going to show a different ancestral signature than someone whose family has lived in Western Honshu for generations, not because one of them is somehow more or less authentically connected to Japan, but because the actual historical populations that contributed to those regions were different, arrived at different times, mixed under different conditions, and left different genetic fingerprints behind. As more ancient genomes get sequenced and more modern datasets get cross-referenced against them, these ancestry breakdowns are only going to get more precise, and probably more surprising, not less. There's also a broader lesson embedded in this story that goes beyond Japan specifically, about how quickly our understanding of deep human history is being rewritten right now, across the board, not just in this one region. For most of the 20th century, our picture of ancient population movements was built almost entirely from archaeology, from the physical traces people left behind, tools, pottery, burial sites, the kinds of things you can dig up, measure, and date. That approach produced real insight, but it had real limits too, because physical remains can only tell you so much about who was related to whom, where specific lineages came from, and how populations that look culturally similar or different on the surface were actually connected underneath. Ancient DNA analysis has changed that completely, and it's changed it fast. The tools used in some of this very research, methods for reconstructing genetic family trees, for detecting signs of natural selection buried in genomic data, for running population simulations that test competing hypotheses, says against real evidence, most of these techniques have only become widely usable in the last decade or so, which means a huge amount of what gets published today isn't a minor refinement of old knowledge. It's a genuine first look at questions that were simply unanswerable before, because the technology to answer them didn't exist yet. And that's really the heart of why a story like this deserves attention. It's not just that a few academic papers rearranged some percentages in a population genetics model, though that's certainly part of it. It's that the record of who we are, written directly into our own cells, has been sitting there the entire time, largely unread, waiting for tools, sensitive enough to actually extract meaning from degraded, thousands of years old genetic material. The Jōmon people lived, adapted to conditions we can barely imagine, survived an ice age with nothing but the tools and knowledge they'd developed themselves, and then gradually mixed with later arrivals to become one of several deep ancestral threads woven into the modern population of an entire nation. For thousands of years, that story sat buried, literally, in shell mounds and burial sites scattered across the Japanese archipelago, readable only in fragments through pottery styles and tool assemblages. Now, thanks to genomic sequencing, that story is being read directly from the source, and it turns out to be richer, older, and considerably more complicated than the simplified version most of us grew up learning. The old story said two groups met and mixed. The real story, as best as current evidence can reconstruct it, involves an isolation event tens of thousands of years in the past, a small population that endured one of the harshest climate periods in recent human history, at least 3 and possibly 4 distinct ancestral contributions layered on top of each other over thousands of years, and a genetic legacy that continues to show up in measurable ways in the bodies of people living today, whether or not they've ever thought about where their ancestors actually came from. That's the version, supported by the DNA. And unlike the old textbook explanation, this one is still being written, updated with every new genome researchers manage to sequence, every new dataset they manage to compare, every new question they think to ask of evidence that's been sitting quietly in the ground, waiting for thousands of years. Consider what that means the next time someone repeats the old 2 population version as settled fact. It isn't wrong to say that Jōmon and the Yayoi both contributed to modern Japanese ancestry. That much is still true and still supported by every study mentioned here. But treating it as the complete answer ignores an Ice Age isolation event that predates farming by tens of thousands of years, a third migration wave from the imperial period that most people have never heard of, a possible 4th ancestral thread still being investigated, and a regional genetic diversity within Japan itself that a single blended ratio could never capture. The real answer was always going to be messier than a 2-sentence summary, because human population history almost always is, everywhere on Earth, not just in Japan. What makes this particular case worth paying attention to right now is simply that the tools finally caught up to the question, and the evidence is arriving fast enough that keeping up with it, rather than repeating what textbooks said a generation ago, is now genuinely possible for anyone willing to follow the research as it lands.